Hi everyone, welcome to this short video. I'm joined by Leigh from Soldo, and hopefully through the next 5 minutes we're going to give you a real quick introduction to Soldo, how it works, how you can use it as an accountant, and how the integrations work with the accounting softwares. So just to start, Leigh, could you give an introduction to Soldo?
Hey Rowan, how you going? So what we're trying to address is this issue where there's not a lot of controls often in businesses around how they spend money. And so if you think about it, you've sort of got your bank account and your money set in this little pot. And it's just sort of exposed to the world, right? You've got money going out in all these directions, and sometimes it's staff paying out, sometimes it's subscriptions that are sort of getting into your pocket. And in a kind of simple sense, what Soldo does is just throws a bit of a protective ring around that cash. So then we top money up into the Soldo account, and then we spend through the Soldo account into there. So whether you kind of think of it, if you're a sci-fi fan, as an airlock, or as I mentioned the other day, when you go through a safari park and you've got those two sets of gates before you go into the dangerous animals, that's what it's for. It's to sort of put a little bit of distance between your cash and the outside world and give you some structure around how you let that flow out of the business.
Yeah, that's pretty useful to see the diagrams like that. And I think you mentioned that you're seeing more and more uses for not just the employees going out and buying things for themselves, but just company subscriptions or just general company spending going in there.
Yeah, so certainly online subscriptions as well is a growing part of running any business now. You know, for most businesses now, that we're having to pay a regular subscription, whether it's Xero and apps in kind of our world, or whether it's Adobe Creative Cloud if you're in sort of the creative industries. So managing those sorts of subscriptions and having some functionality around that is certainly very valuable. But yeah, there's a ton of use cases for it.
And so if we think about how a business might start using Soldo with their accountant, what sort of arrangement is there within the software to, like, what can the accountant do in terms of getting involved?
We have to be a little bit tighter than some products in terms of user access, because of course it's dealing with people's money, right? And you need to be careful how much access people have to that. But at the top level, we see some firms that are working as FDs, and they're actually distributing funds around and moving money around, and they're happy with that. And they'll have an accountant role that is just really able to log in and look at reports and see what people have been doing. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the functionality of how people can log in. But in terms of how people are working on it together, again, that it varies based on how engaged the firm want to be with that client on this topic. There are some that are just saying, look, spend on this card and capture the receipts, and that'll help with the bookkeeping and the outsourcing. There are others that are really sitting down and saying, well, look, we know that you've got issues in spending on these certain areas of the business. So let's ring fence some money within Soldo and do some proactive spend management control. And of course, that firm is then building a service line out of that. So there's a whole range in terms of how firms are working with clients with it.
And typically, a Soldo accountant will come on with a partnership with you and then set up and offer the integrations with accounting software for their clients. Which accounting software integrations do you offer?
So we integrate with Xero. We have a bank feed integration through into Xero, and we've got an integration with QuickBooks as well. We've also got integrations with NetSuite, and we're looking at others. But really, you can export a CSV bank statement from Soldo and then import that into any accounting product. With the Xero feed, that works at sort of two levels. We've got the daily bank feed that goes across that you get, or you'd be used to getting in any sort of bank account. So we push across the high level data in that. So the date, the name, the amount, that goes through as it normally would. And then that forms part of the sort of left-hand side of the bank reconciliation. And then separately, we can attach metadata, such as pictures of receipts, chart of account code, VAT treatment, all those sorts of things. And then push that across into Xero once we're happy with it. And that then forms the right-hand side of the Xero bank reconciliation. So we've got both elements of that done. And if it's got pushed across with good processes and it's nice and clean and clear and everybody's done what they need to do, the reconciliation process in Xero should be pretty straightforward.
And you're pushing over line items as well. So if there's mixed VAT on an expense, that's going to handle that.
Yeah, that's right. So you can go through the list of the transactions that you want to push across into Xero. And if you want to break out the line items and treat them differently, whether that's with different chart of account codes, different tracking categories, different VAT treatment, you can deal with that in there.
Is there like a kind of a warning, say, if you haven't attached a picture, don't export?
You can set your policy as a business at the client level of what you expect to be in place before you move stuff across. And I guess more personally, you power reminders with that as well. So if an end user hasn't completed everything that you've said they need to, you can set Soldo to send them a reminder out and give them a bit of a nudge and say, look, you need to get your attachments in.
Yeah. So if you're doing the bookkeeping, then you haven't got to keep going back to people and saying we're missing this.
Yeah, ideally so. I mean, you can never get people to completely toe the line 100%, can you? But I think kind of notifications popping up literally when they've spent with the card and they've actually got the receipt in their hand, and then reminders, kind of on a Friday afternoon up to the end of the month when they haven't got it in, is about as far as you can go without literally knocking on their door, I think, and rummaging through their paperwork.
Yeah. That's the end goal has to be try and automate everything, but good steps to get there anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks for the introduction. I think if anyone wants to go and have a look at Soldo, you offer a free account for accountants.
Yep.
To sign up for.
That's right.
And so it's a really good way of testing out how it works in your own practice. And then obviously you can start bringing in clients if you think that is a solution for them.
Yeah, definitely. A nice way to get started is just to set up a Soldo card for the account, even if it's an online card, and just stick your Xero subscription on there and have that run through for a month and just see how that goes. As we said earlier on, most practices have got a number of subscriptions going through now. So just putting them onto that card and letting it go through is a great way to start. And we don't have any contracts and there's no minimum top-up amount. So you can just try it out and, like you say, see how you go.
Perfect. Thanks for your time.
No worries. Cheers, Rowan.
Cheers.